talk about it just a little bit. Thanks, Philip, for letting me know that that wasn't. I don't know what was going on, but anyhow, I had to start the stream, but it's working now. But let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen with you. Okay. So Psalm 23. David is the writer of the psalm. David, an incredible individual in and of himself. He says this: "The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake." Now, there's a couple of things I want you to notice, and most of them are on the slide there. Notice some of the verbiage. He says, "Makes me lie down," right? So lying down, that sounds like a pause. Beside the still water, that sounds like it's a refreshing. Restores my soul, same thing, refreshing, like a pause. But the thing that we really need to take note of is it says that He makes me lie down, right? So I think maybe it's the tendency on our part to not want to slow down, to want to stack up the amount of things that we do, and to maybe even be overly ambitious about those things. I mean, I once had someone tell me, I read through the Bible 5 times last year, and I think it was five. It was like 5 or 6 times. I'm like, well, good. What did you learn? Well, that I could read the Bible through 5 times in a year. And I'm thinking, maybe you should have built in some time of reflection there. Maybe, you should have spent some time in letting the lesson catch up to you. It's great to read through the Bible in a year, and I think that's a pretty realistic thing. But I think anybody who does that should build in some time when they can actually think about the things that they are, reading, periods of reflection, because sometimes we're not real good about doing that. It said He makes me lie down. He knows what's good for me. God is my, the Lord is my shepherd. He wants the things that are best for me. And sometimes that means that I need to take a pause. I need to be beside those still waters. I need to have that restoring, that takes place. But it's not just Psalm 23. I mean, it's all over the place. We'll do some of these just so you can, see. But back in Isaiah chapter 40, and verses 30 through 31, the prophet writes, "Even youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Now, if you look at a couple of things that he says here, he says, they who wait upon the Lord here, and literally, this is a word that was used kind of in a pictorial sense to refer to a place that collected, water, right? A place that collected water, a pool, a place where people would, wait, right? I mean, you think of those old westerns. You've seen an old western? Guy rides into town on a horse and he hitches his horse up to the post there over the trough of water. Well, think of kind of like that. But for us as human beings, you can think of it kind of like that image from Psalm 23. It leads us beside the still waters, right? It's a place of reflection. It's a place for us to wait, to gather, to maybe meet and have fellowship. But some usages of this word literally render it that way, to gather. But it means to have hope or to expect, to collect together or bind together. So those who wait on the Lord, those who are gathered, those who are hopeful about the Lord, those who are there beside that pool of expectation, will have their strength renewed. So built into this idea that Isaiah says is common to man, that people will grow, even youth will get tired, strength will utterly fail. If you have this period of refreshing, then they're going to mount up with wings as eagles, and they'll run and not be weary, and so on and so forth, right? So now, again, that this is taking it in our spiritual journey now. Does the passage primarily talk about, maybe the future and being with God? Well, sure. But we can we can look at our journey here now and find that the same thing is the case. Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah chapter 31. And notice verse 24. And I think it's just that one verse. Let's do 24 and 25. He says, "And Judah and all its cities shall dwell there together, and the farmers and those who wander with their flocks. For I will satisfy the weary soul, and every languishing soul I will replenish." Right? So with God, there is this reflection or a time of, refreshing. But we don't have to go to the prophets. We can go further back than that, right? We can go back to the second book of the Bible, there in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. Even God in his infinite and amazing, marvelous, wonderful plans to create all that we know in this world, including you and I and everything that we're using tonight to connect, made everything in 6 days. And then on the seventh day, he rested. So God, building into his plans, reveals that part of his plan was this, time of refreshing, this time of reflection. Now go back to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, the second book of the Bible, and begin at verse 8. Building off of that initial rest that God had, he gives all of the the Ten Commandments here. But notice verse 8 through 10. "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or your sojourner who is within your gates." God builds an entire day into the structure of the creation of his people, that via the law of Moses, builds into the forming of the nation of his people, a whole day that is devoted to not doing the physical work, but to have a period of reflection and refreshing, right? And not only was this repeated every week, but then it was repeated on a regular basis, annually, and then there were other larger Sabbaths as well, going all the way up to that year of Jubilee. Which we're never told in the Bible that they celebrated. They may have, but we never see an example of it being celebrated in the Bible. But they have a whole system, in other words, of Sabbaths, of this built-in time of reflection and refreshing, where they can focus on God and how He is working in their lives, because it should remind us. It should be in those moments that we find ourselves getting closer to God and who He is, right? You ever meet somebody who was going through a hard time? I mean, really hard time. They lost a loved one, or something like that. And one of the things that people often will say to folks like that is, well, it's good to keep busy, keep your mind off of it. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes that's true and it hurts us, because when we get so busy, our minds don't engage. We don't really think about the things that we need to be thinking about. God built in an entire system of days so that the people would have that period set aside to reflect on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. But skip forward in Exodus to chapter 23, chapter 20. Or, I'm sorry, not 23, 33, and you'll find another example here of of this rest, as it is mentioned in the Bible. And he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here." Right? So, talking about talking about rest again. And sometimes it's just mentioned. Go over to the Psalms. Psalms have a lot, could not include all of the ones that are in the Psalms. And sometimes it doesn't refer to rest as a period of reflection. Of course, we know that rest is also a term that is kind of like Canaan land. It has, in one sense, a very physical fulfillment, but it also has that larger fulfillment where we're talking about heaven. Well, rest is used that way as well. Joshua took the people into the land, and they took part of that rest. But then the book of Hebrews tells us that there's a part that remains for us, and we can have that rest, or we can miss out on that rest. That will come in the days of eternity. But we have that verbiage there that kind of reflects it. But that's in eternity. But there's also the need for us to have it here while we're alive. So a lot of the Psalms talk about it in that sense. But Psalm 3 in verse 5, he says, "I laid down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me." Now, why would the psalmist tell us that? Why would any psalmist, and of course David is the psalmist here, why would David want to tell us about him lying down, sleeping, and waking up again? Well, because I think he understands that something so simple. It's something so simple, and yet it is vital. It's important for us to have those times where we turn things off, but then it's important for us to have those times where we're getting away from the normal tasks, and we're actually thinking about what we're doing, how we're living our life, and in our case for this class, how we are growing. Psalm 4 and verse 8, "In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." Go over to Psalm 116. Psalm 116 and verse 7. The psalmist again says, "Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you." And then the last one we'll do, Psalm 127. Psalm 127, and let's just do verses 1 and 2. It's a short psalm, but he says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go to rest, eating the bread of anxious toils, for he gives to his beloved sleep." Right? It is by, what the psalmist is saying is, it is by God's very design that you don't spend your days in anxious toil, but you have times of refreshing and reflection. Now bounce over to the New Testament, and you have some similar things there. Let's do the ones from the Gospels first, very simply because they all kind of say a similar thing. So we're not going to read all of them. We do want to read Matthew 11, and then verse 28. Christ says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Right? So a lot of times we take that to mean okay, we may not have it easy in this world, but eventually we're going to get that rest, and eventually it's going to be not a burden for us, and eventually we're going to find rest for our souls. I don't know that that's completely the case. I think Christ had just as much of this life in his purview when he said these things as he did the next life. Because what greater peace is there in this world than knowing you're saved in the next, and that you're going to be with God, and you have a close relationship with him. Why? Because you spent time in enjoying the life that God gave you, in rest, in reflection, and you grew by those things. Let's go over to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, verse 31. It says, "And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And of course, this is Christ with his, disciples, and this was a common thing that Christ says that, or the Bible says that, he was alone, or he was alone with his disciples, or he went into the wilderness alone to engage in some spiritual activity, typically prayer. Now, sometimes, we're told that he goes into the wilderness, and we're not exactly given an explanation. But we can assume that it's kind of the same, thing. Go over to the book of Mark. We're in the book of Mark. Just go over to verse 47 in the same chapter, down just a few. It says, "And when evening had come, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land." All right, so Christ told them, go ahead on the boat, and he was there on the land, by himself. We're not told what he was doing, but he had that period of, solitude. Go over to Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9 and verse 18. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, "Who did the crowd say that I am?" Right? So he's praying alone, but the disciples are with him. He's in the midst of this period where he's concerned about, self. I mean, it's kind of a weird construction. I mean, how is he alone if the disciples are with him? Isn't that kind of an odd phrasing? Now, it happened that he was praying alone. The disciples were with him. He was spending time in this spiritual reflection through the avenue of, prayer. I mean, a person can be alone, but be with other people. Look at John chapter 6. John chapter 6 and verse 15. "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain, by himself. And when evening came, the disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, started across the sea to Capernaum. It was dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. And the sea became rough because the strong wind was blowing, and we know the rest of the story. Calm as a storm, peace be still, all of those things. But there are many times in the life of Christ where this type of thing happens. For some reason, he stays behind. For some other reason, he goes into the wilderness. Most often, we're told again to pray. But he had, even from his own ministry, this time of reflection. Everybody remembers that, Mary and Martha and Lazarus were very good friends with Jesus, right? And as a matter of fact, when Lazarus dies, Mary and Martha are disappointed. I mean, this is your friend, and you could have come and you could have helped him, but you didn't. You didn't. And plenty of times, he's with them, and you go through the Bible and you see him at the house of Mary and Martha, and of course, the lessons that they're going to learn there are going to be some incredible things and through some incredible time spent with Jesus. But much of why he was there was to get away from the crowd. To get away from those who had questions, to spend a little bit of time, with friends, kind of by himself, off in a distant place. So even during, Christ's ministry, you see this over and over, but it makes perfect sense because, God built it into, the law going all the way back to the time of creation. Remember that seventh day, he rested. He builds a system of laws around it and says, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. So it's no wonder that when his son comes into this world and engages in his own ministry, that he builds into that ministry this time of, reflection, this time of, refreshing. Everybody needs a break from time to time, right? There is power in the pause, as one person has said. But what is that power? Well, number one, I think that when we take a pause, when we step away from the things that we're doing, and again, I know that can be very, very hard. But when we step away from it, it empowers, insight. It enables us to look at the things that, we are doing and determine whether or not they're actually working, whether or not they're actually doing the things that they're supposed to be, doing. It's amazing to me. One of my favorite shows on TV, um, and is a cooking show. And on this cooking show, they have the chef comes in and points out all the flaws of the restaurant, and then they try to fix those flaws and kind of move that restaurant forward. And almost without fail, you have a group of people when he comes in, he has to tell them that they're in denial because they're doing a lot of things. They're running around and they seem to be accomplishing a lot, and yet at the end of the day, they're losing thousands of dollars every single week because the business is just not running well. But one of the things that he does is pulls every single one of them aside and gets them to reflect on, okay, what is the problem? And when they do that, they can finally work their way past the problem. It's the same with every single one of the episodes that they have for this show, and it's true to life as well. We find ourselves entrenched in a problem. The best thing we can do is step away from it for a time. We find ourselves with stressed and anxious and tired in the work. The best thing we can do is step away for a little while, gain some insight, right? Gain some insight, and then come back to it. Number two, there's power in the pause because power in the pause when we give it a time and space, right? When we give it a time and a place or space, whichever one you want to use. And what this means is that it has to be a definite thing. It has to be something that we plan for. If I don't have a designated thinking time, and if I don't have a designated thinking place, then chances are pretty good I'll never stop and I'll never reflect, right? So I, from time to time, will use it's called, I can't remember what the name of the app is, but I call it the thinking space. And it's just a place that when I have an idea, I'll put it in there, and then, I'll come back to it and reflect on it. I'll spend time thinking about that idea. Most of the time, it's when someone, like Brother Steve on Sunday mornings is teaching his class. I'll be sitting there taking my notes and come up with something, and I'll put it in there so that I can stew on it later, reflect on it, and build on it, and make it into something that's more usable. But if we don't have a time and we don't have a place, then it becomes a difficult thing. Number three, pausing must be intentional and intended to enrich our thinking in some way, right? When Christ went to the wilderness to be alone, he went there to pray. Again, sometimes we're not told, but sometimes we are, told. Sometimes he was in there, he was alone with his disciples, and of course he's teaching them. And you're saying, well, in that part of ministry, but he's growing the relationships. It's not about necessarily always teaching them. It's about growing, the relationships, and doing so with intention. We have to be intentional about our, thinking when we pause. I mean, it's one thing to just pause and go have fun, and that's good too. And I think that's needed, but that's not really what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a time when you pull away from the work. And then you spend relaxed, non-anxious moments reflecting upon the things that you've accomplished, right? So you're thinking, well, wait a minute, that sounds like work. It's just thought work. Well, maybe so to a certain degree, but maybe you're so stressed or bogged that you need to get away, just have the fun, but then come back and step into this intentional, enriched thinking mode before you begin the work again. And then finally, number four, when you do pause, you get a pause using your eyes. And I'm going to go into these just very briefly. Investigation, incubation, illumination, and illustration. Now, again, all of these go back to, intention, right? Intention to enrich thinking when it comes to us pausing and setting aside a time when we're reflecting on the work that we do. Means that we're investigating, right? Okay, so what did we do? How well did we do it? And then, we got to move that thing forward. So we talk about, the idea of incubating. We have ideas. So this is a time when we can think about the ideas that come from our rethinking of the work that we're doing. And then once we have those ideas, then we start adding, further illumination to it, and then illustration to it. And those are just basically, kind of filling the gaps. Think of it this way: if incubation is the outline, then illumination and illustration is the full sermon, right? Incubation is kind of the outline. Illumination and illustration is you putting the whole thing together. This is your plan, right? So you investigate. You find out the who, what, where, when, and why of your thinking and what you're doing and your growth, and then you think about it. You stew on it. You build it. You grow it. You illuminate. You illustrate, and so on. All right. So, powerful pause questions. One of the biggest tools that we can use, and again, I know we did this kind of last week too. In our pause, in the time that we spend reflecting on the things that we do, will be questions that we ask ourselves. The set of questions, of course, is going to vary depending on the intention of your pause. Why are you doing it, right? Now, maybe you want to grow your prayer life. Maybe you want to grow in your study. Maybe you want to grow in your relationships or solve a problem or grow as a leader or, any of those areas. But when we do grow, for instance, we want to ask a certain, difficult questions. For instance, if we're interested in growing a relationship, we might ask, do I really value people? How do I know that I value people? How do I show that I value the people around me? What do I bring to the table that shows people that I value them? What evidence do I have, for it? Do I know what their, quote, love language is? How do I serve others? How can I prove that I'm gracious, merciful, kind, et cetera, right? These are some of the questions that we could ask if we are interested in growing, a relationship with someone, church, family member, so on and so forth. So, time of reflection and refreshing is the time in which you would ask these things. All right? This one's key. Ask the questions. Get specific questions about your specific area. If you want to study the Bible more, right? Well, how much do I study? How much can I study? What am I doing to study? Have I grown in my study? There are tons of questions. If you need someone to help you with the questions, by all means, you got a whole congregation of people who would be more than happy to help you come up with some questions to challenge you in your period of reflection about how you can grow in a specific area. But here's the important thing. Once you get the questions, you want to write the questions down. And then as you answer the questions, you want to write out your answers to the question. And I know that sounds maybe silly. Well, I can answer that. How do I value people? Yes, I value people, right? But then how do you show it? Well, there's something about writing it down that really gets us to think about it. Maybe it's because it stimulates us on multiple levels. I don't know exactly why, but there's something about writing it down. And here's what I've found in my personal experience with this, is that when I go to write down the answer, I have one answer in my head, but as I write it, I start to change that answer. And I make it better. And many times, the answer that I put on the page is not the answer that I started with in my head. Because I'm putting it on paper. And there's something that kind of seems permanent about that. And there's something that maybe seems kind of challenging about that. So if you're really serious about, growing and spending some time in reflection about your growth, then you're going to get yourself a notebook. If you don't have one, we can get you one. But a journal or, something fancy or something less fancy, whatever. All you need is a writing instrument and some paper. Write the questions down, and then as you think about these things, again, you're not studying anything. You're not engaged in some other discipline. You're just spending time in thought, thinking about, evaluating, yourself, and then, rethinking, illuminating, illustrating, right? So you're writing these answers out. It's important that we do that, because again, we sometimes will end up changing it. So, if you look at the lesson as a whole, the Bible definitely encourages us to have this period of refreshing and reflection, from creation all the way up through the ministry of Christ. And the encouragement that we get from the New Testament tells us, look, you got to have those times where you stop and you think about what you're doing, where you stop and you reflect about where you've been and where you're going. So number one, create a place where you consistently and effectively pause and reflect. Number two, schedule your pause. right? Don't say, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, because guess what? You'll probably never do it. And I'll be the first one to raise my hand to be guilty of, that one. But, it's something that you shouldn't do. It's something that ends up probably hurting you. Number 3, approach it with intention and specific purpose. It's not just a relaxation time, right? It's not just a, go and have fun and swing on the hammock time. We have another word for that, vacation. But this is different than that. And then finally, number 4, write your questions and then write the answers. Use a journal. Write these things out. Commit yourself, to them, and being better at the things that we do on a regular basis. And you're going to see growth. You're going to see growth happening as you put these things into practice and as you begin to move yourself forward. So again, create that place, schedule, approach it with intention, write it out. But I guess maybe we could have added right before that, you need to be specific about what you're trying to grow, right? It's pointless for you to say, well, I'm going to spend tomorrow right after lunch, 12:15, reflecting on how, I can grow. Well, what do you mean by how you can grow? How you can grow what? That can mean any of 1,000 things. So be specific. Be specific. And then focus on those things that you need to do to accomplish that. Guys, I appreciate everybody coming out tonight. That's all I have for this evening. We'll pick up next time. We get just a few more of these. John Maxwell has 15 in his book. We're not doing all of them. We're just doing a few of the ones that I saw pertinent to our lessons, and that can be helpful to us in a spiritual sense. And I think this is a big one in the Bible. It goes along very well with some spiritual disciplines we've already talked about: fasting, prayer, solitude. Those are some of the things that you see in this idea of reflection. But again, remember to put your items in the chat that you may want us to send out as updates. Also, in just a moment or so, one of our co-hosts here are going to kind of unmute everybody, and you can have that period of fellowship. But I'm going to go ahead and mute myself while I shut down all of the other feeds. But let's have a word of prayer before we close out this evening. Heavenly Father, we come humbly bound before you. We just thank you so much for this time that we've had, the fellowship we are about to share, and the union that you have created between us all. We ask that it be a profitable one, that you give each and every one of us kind and loving hearts that sees the best in each other and strives always to do those things that edify. Again, we thank you for this time of study that we've had this evening. We ask that you bless each and every one who's here this evening. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.
Have you been watering those plants because they look like they're actually alive?
I've hit them a few times.
Needs help on your eating, razor. Hey, Tim.